being here. I'm Connie Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. And very glad that you're here and that you found your way through. I know there were some parking issues and issues with a truck in the alley and all of that. So thanks for your persistence and being here. This is Intersections Luncheon, and we hold this always on the first Friday of the month, essentially during the school year, and tackle a whole lot of different issues. At the core of what Intersections is really about civil dialogue on important issues, and so it's just a broad spectrum of issues, and we always invite an expert on whatever that is and have a good conversation. So we'll have the opportunity after Brian talks a little bit to ask some questions and really engage with him. So glad that you are here. For those of you who are new, a special welcome to you. And I would just remind folks that reservations are very much appreciated, and it's really primarily to make sure we have enough food to feed you. So if you're on our email list and want to attend, if you would make those reservations, that would be great. But I'm excited today to have Dr. Brian Farrell, who's going to talk with us about racial disparities in Iowa's criminal justice system. And Dr. Farrell is a lecturer in law and human rights, director of the Citizen Lawyer Program, and associate director of the Center for Human Rights at the University of Iowa College of Law. He is also an adjunct lecturer at the National University of Ireland Galway and was a co-founder of the Innocence Project of Iowa, an all-volunteer nonprofit dedicated to preventing and remedying wrongful convictions. Brian received his law degree from the University of Iowa and a master's degree and PhD in international human rights law from the National University of Ireland Galway. He practiced law in Iowa and Georgia, focusing on criminal defense, appeals, and post-conviction relief. He teaches international law, human rights, and criminal law courses, and is the author of over 20 publications on international law, human rights, criminal law, and legal education. I want to welcome Dr. Farrell, please.
Let's make sure I have this on. I want to make, okay, I think you can hear me with this.
Yep.
Let me know if you have any problems hearing me. So thanks for the invitation. It's good to be here, and I'm kind of excited to talk about this topic. I just want to share a little bit about my interest and involvement in this issue. I practiced criminal law for a number of years, as Connie explained. I now teach at the law school. This is not, racial disparities, not an area that I do research per se in. It's not an area that I would say that I am a self-proclaimed expert in, but it's an issue that I've been around, I've been familiar with, and I guess appropriately, given the title of the luncheon, it really is like at the intersections of a lot of my different interests, of criminal law, of Iowa's legal system, of human rights and civil rights. But I guess I would just want to give the disclaimer that what I'm sharing with you is some numbers, some hard numbers, but then some of my thoughts on what might be going on here and what we might do in relation to these issues. So I will share a little bit of data, and then what I really want to get into is to try to explore why these numbers are potentially problematic, why they exist, and what we might be able to do here in Iowa. And of course, I really do want to get to our discussion. Oh, sorry, I have a little box popped up here. There we go. So I know that we like to think about, and we want to think about, our justice system as being fair and equitable. And so when we talk about this notion of disparities, and we're talking about today disparities in Iowa's corrections system, racial disparities in the criminal justice system, I look at disparities as a lack of equality, particularly when there is an unfairness about it, right? And that's why I think that this is such an important topic, that we want to have faith in a fair and equal criminal justice system. And I think it's important when we recognize that there is something that is not operating as we expect, that we look at it, engage with it, and try to deconstruct it. So the reason that I think prison disparities is an important topic is we like to think of our laws as being equal on the face, right? We like to think of our system as treating all people equally. and we like to think that our procedures and laws are set up in a way that they are going to lead to equal treatment. And so when there are issues like this, it's important to look at the outcomes and say, do the outcomes match what we expect? If we think that we have a fair system, if we think that we have laws that are on their face written in an equal manner, are they producing equitable results? And if they are not, we need to look at what are the factors that explain that and what can we potentially do to intervene. So let's look at the data. In the state of Iowa, we have a population just over 3 million people. And this is not unfamiliar probably to most of you, but we are about 90%, 91% a white state. We have a small but significant black population. And here we're looking at black and white disparities in these numbers that I'm showing you, but a 4% African American population. Our prison population does not reflect that, right? Our prison population is between those two groups about 65% white and 25% black. And this is particularly stark when we look at the ratio between these groups, okay? So here we are looking at incarceration per 100,000 people compared between the black rate of incarceration and the white rate of incarceration. And I think probably many of you know that Iowa had the distinction not too long ago of having the greatest disparity in terms of ratio between black and white prison population. We have fallen to third now. We are at about 11 to 1 ratio between the black and white prison population. And this data is coming from the Sentencing Project. So again, when we have these different outcomes, I think it's important for us to examine why that's the case and to determine whether there are variables that we can potentially alter, potentially intervene in to minimize this type of different outcome. And so I want to start by just, I guess, asking you, does a disparate outcome like this inherently mean that there's some fundamental inequality? Does it mean that there's something nefarious going on with the system? Maybe it does, but here's where I want to stop and point out to you. The ratio between female prison inmates in Iowa and male prison inmates is about 10 to 1. Okay? You have about 800 women in prison, about 8,000 men in prison. Okay? So does that inherently mean that our system is stacked against men? That it is unfair as to men? And I think the answer is it might, right? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Maybe there are a lot of factors going on here. There are probably reasons why we have this different ratio between men and women, as there may be reasons why we have this ratio between blacks and whites. So what's the simplest explanation? If you call into a talk show and this question is being discussed, what is the simple explanation of why there are such a huge ratio of difference between black prison population and white prison population? Blacks commit more crimes. Okay? So, I mean, that is a possible explanation, right? That is something that we start with. Is the reason because this system that is set up fairly and equitably and the laws that operate equally, is it because they lead to a very distinct, disparate outcome? Okay, that's where we need to start. Do we think that that's the reason? How many of you think that's the sole reason? Okay, so we need to look beyond that, right? We need to keep in mind there is that possibility, but we need to look beyond that and say what else is going on here. And for me, one important starting point is to look at the fact that we're talking about prison population, okay? Before somebody ends up in prison, what has happened? And I'm not even going to go back to, history and personal circumstances, but let's start with the action that lands them in prison. A crime has been detected, it's been reported, It's been investigated. Decisions have been made about charging. The case is prosecuted. It goes through a judicial system. A conviction occurs, and a person is sentenced. Okay? So there are a lot of factors in there. And again, I think that we want to think that all of those factors are operating equally and equitably at every stage. But I think it's important to recognize the potential that that might not be the case. In some instances, maybe that's not the case for reasons that we understand or even are deliberate. In other cases, it might be for reasons that we are unaware of or that are happening outside of our conscious action, right? And so this is where I think it's really important to kind of think about all these factors that can lead to this type of disparate outcome. And again, here we haven't even talked about background factors, socioeconomic factors, educational factors, other factors that potentially are at play. Here we're focusing mostly on the system, how the system operates, and the human actors within the system, okay? And so this is where I want to focus. And again, these are really my thoughts on what might be going on here that helps explain why we have this disparate outcome and what might we be able to do to intervene or to minimize these differences. So the first thing that I want to mention is the way that we structure crimes. We write laws, we make conduct prohibited, and we, through our legislature, we select sentences for particular crimes, okay? All of those things are decisions. All of those things, again, involve humans. They involve the political process. They involve our judgments about what we value and don't. The, I think, sort of classic example that comes to mind in terms of how we categorize crimes, and some of you are probably familiar with this, is differences between crack and powder cocaine, how those are treated in the law, or how they were classically treated in the law, even if the base amount of cocaine is equal, okay? The way that federal laws, for example, were written more harshly punished people who were in possession or produced crack cocaine than powder cocaine. And, you know, was that overt bias to more harshly treat the population that was more likely to be using crack cocaine versus powder cocaine? Was that something subconscious? Was that something that was a reaction to circumstances? A lot of reasons there, but the fact is the outcome was different, right? And so we need to think about that. We need to think about how are our laws structured. You know, somebody mentioned to me about a year ago, and I thought this was kind of compelling and something that we lawyers don't think about. Our legal system, our legal structures, were primarily developed to establish possession of and protection of property. The English legal system, that's kind of the impetus for the legal system, right? And our criminal justice system, to an extent, still reflects that. That property is important to us, and offenses against property are important to us. There are things that we can do, there are things that we are doing, there are things that we should do to try to ensure that we minimize the potential for disparate outcomes when it comes to categorization of crimes. In Iowa, we have something called minority impact statements that are attached to bills passed by the legislature. We have a legislator in the room, so I might defer to him to give us his take on this. But my sense is this is an important step, but it's also an underutilized step, right? If we know that there's a potential for a disparate outcome in a law that we're passing, and we don't have a robust discussion of that, we don't have full consideration of that, the fact that we have this process, this minority impact statement process, doesn't do a lot to correct the problem, okay? So we have to both have the tools, but then use the tools when they are available. You know, this past session, there were some changes in terms of crimes for which a person can seek an expungement, changes in robbery statutes, some small, meaningful things. But again, I think that we need to think about the structure of what conduct is prohibited, and how did we arrive at those judgments of what is prohibited and what sentences are attached to particular criminal activity. And I'll suggest that, law and order, we were just discussing this, law and order is a very strong political selling point, right? And so that is often going to be paramount in the mind of a lawmaker. So again, just one possible explanation for why we have this these disparate numbers in Iowa. Another, and somebody mentioned this, is implicit bias, okay? Are many of you familiar with the concept of implicit bias? We hear a lot about it. I think that it was described to me recently as a hot topic, and I think it's a hot topic because it's important research that we now need to understand and take into account in most things that we do. But essentially, implicit bias explains the unconscious processes, the mental shortcuts that we make based on our experiences and backgrounds that lead us to perhaps make decisions or respond to situations, respond to circumstances, especially when there is pressure, when time is limited, in particular ways, okay? And so a lot of this is just categorization. We as humans, and this is brain science, implicit bias. We as humans, we tend to want to categorize things quickly. It helps us process. It helps us navigate through our days. It helps us figure out, is this the better street to walk down than this, okay? But over time, those patterns can lead us to make judgments that might not actually be warranted based on the actual circumstances of a situation, right? And so it can lead us to respond to different things differently. It can lead to over-categorization, essentially unconscious stereotyping based on our own experiences. And I always remind myself, I can come and talk about this. I can talk about human rights. But all of my perspectives, all of my knowledge is shaped by my own experience. It's shaped by being a straight white man from rural Iowa who works at a public university. I have children, I speak English, I was raised in a faith tradition. All those things in small ways, they impact how I see the world. They impact how I look at other people, how I interact with other people. The thing with implicit bias is that it is totally human. It's totally natural. This is something that we can't eliminate. It is, however, something that we need to be aware of and something that we need to take into account that it possibly can impact the way that we make decisions, the way that we sort of navigate our world. And in terms of implicit bias, what I would say is this is an area that the criminal justice system is just starting to be cognizant of, just starting to think about, how do we address this? How do we address the fact that, a police officer, a judge, a witness in a crime may look at things, may respond to things slightly different based on their own experiences, okay? And what I will tell you is that by and large, I would say this is an issue that we don't have sufficient understanding. We really haven't interrogated how this impacts every stage in our system. From my work, I'd say this is somewhat anecdotal, but my understanding is there's not a lot of training on implicit bias for law enforcement. It is happening in particular law enforcement agencies. I know that the city of Cedar Rapids, along with Davenport and a lot of other large jurisdictions, have done trainings for officers on implicit bias, helping them understand and recognize it. And with implicit bias, the biggest antidote is awareness, just recognizing that this happens and it can influence our thinking. But I was called about 2 years ago by a rural sheriff's office who said, we would like to do training along these lines, and we can't find any resources. There's essentially one outfit out of Florida that the DOJ, Department of Justice, works with, and they cost quite a bit. There are not a lot of options for law enforcement to do this type of training. And, hopefully those of you who've never heard of implicit bias before will know this much more after you leave here. But unfortunately, it's the type of topic that learning this much in a half hour or an hour talk during a conference doesn't do a lot to, it makes us aware. It might make us go learn more. but it's not necessarily going to get us to the level where we really have that understanding that's going to impact outcomes. And so, I would say that implicit bias is one of those things that needs to be part of training for law enforcement, needs to be part of training for public defenders, for prosecutors, for others in the system. This is a place where I will point and say that our state courts, our judicial branch under the leadership of Chief Justice Cady, has taken really important steps to train every employee in the judicial branch, so judges, clerks, court reporters, in implicit bias and to understand how it might impact their actions. But I don't think it's happening outside of that space. I don't think it is happening in the same way as mandated training for other actors in the system. And I'm at a law school, and I would say even within legal education, this isn't something that is being taught in a deliberate, thoughtful, integrated way in the curriculum. I will also point out, well, I'll save this for the end. The next factor that I just wanted to mention is, and it's very much tied with implicit bias, is representation, right? Again, when we think about the actors in the system, who are they? And, frankly, what do they look like? I will tell you that when I go in a courthouse, or when I used to go into a correctional facility, I saw most of the people in authority looking an awful lot like me, okay? And that's not a bad thing. That's not a knock on middle-aged redheads at all, whose red hair is slowly fading. But it does matter. I think that it is something that we need to be deliberate thinking about. What does demographic representation look like in law enforcement and in the judiciary and in prosecutors' offices? In Iowa, we have 99 elected prosecutors. We have a lot of assistant county attorneys. How many of those people are coming from diverse backgrounds? How many women are in those roles, especially as we get to higher levels of power? So again, I think that just this notion of representation, do those people, do those actors who are making decisions, whether it's an individual decision for one person or whether it's societal decisions, do they look like and are they representative of the community as a whole? And I'll think about even this, our elected bodies. Does our legislature, do our 99 county boards of supervisors, do our elected officials represent, going back to that first slide, even those pretty minimal numbers of diversity in Iowa, including, again, 50% gender equality? One thing that I will say that I think is significant, and she spoke recently at a conference that I was at, former Representative Helen Miller is now the chair of the Iowa Board of Parole, African-American, female lawmaker, longtime lawmaker from Fort Dodge. And, I hope that is more than symbolic. She has been very involved in justice reform conversations. And so I hope that is a positive step, at least on the back end of parole decisions. Racial profiling. Again, I think probably most of you are familiar with the concept of racial profiling, that people might be targeted, people of color, typically men of color, might be targeted, particularly on the streets, right? That they might be stopped for infractions at a higher rate than non-whites. There was some information compiled by USA Today and the Des Moines Register, and this goes back a few years, I think it was from 2012. But the arrest rate for blacks versus whites in most cities in Iowa was about 5 to 1, okay? And an awful lot of this would be arrests on the street, traffic violations, and other stops. I noted, as I looked at this again today, the three highest cities, the three highest disparities in terms of arrest rate, Urbandale, Cedar Falls, and Bettendorf. Bettendorf was a 10 to 1 rate. And anyone want to tell me what jumped into my mind about those three? What's similar about those three?
They're right next door to the unminority populations.
Yep. So, and again, like, not that this is a good or bad thing, but what she suggested is they are largely white and wealthier suburbs outside of larger population centers, right? So maybe You know, maybe black drivers in Davenport love to go to Bettendorf and drive fast, and that explains it. Maybe. But it could be that there's something about how policing is conducted, about how the decisions being made on a broad basis or an individual basis, the triggers that alert somebody, give their attention to an individual, that could lead to that difference in outcome. So again, I think just something that we need to look at. Chris Barnum, who's a professor at St. Ambrose University, has done some research with a number of cities. I think Cedar Rapids is one of them. He's also worked with Iowa City and Davenport, trying to look at profiling in a data-driven way. And so what he suggested is we don't just look at the population. What we need to do is go out to busy intersections at night and try to do a count of who's driving by, so that when we look at who's being pulled over, we can say this is or is not consistent with who was on the road at this time. And the idea is this is meant to help the police departments. If a department wants to address this and wants to look at their practices and say, hey, is there something off? This is important information to have. Because otherwise, you can very easily shut it down by saying, well, I assume that means that there are more black drivers on the road after midnight, and that's why we're pulling them over. But if you have that background data to say, no, that's not the case, it forces you to look further. And again, maybe there are explanations. There are explanations. Maybe those explanations are, benign. Maybe they're systemic. Maybe they're individualized. Maybe they are related to the practices of a handful of officers. Maybe they're department-wide. But again, recognizing this, looking at it, I think is critically important. Recognizing that these interfaces, this is how a case starts. And when we look at prison population, we have to go back to how does that whole story begin? I'd also point out that there was a department in Connecticut who saw this as an issue, and what the chief of police said is, we are going to de-emphasize equipment violations. We are going to stop pushing our officers to pull people over for, faulty license plate light, things that are not necessarily safety related, and just minimize that and see if that reduces the number of, disparate number of arrests. Pretrial detention, I only put in here to note that there are these steps along the way. After someone is arrested, but before they are incarcerated, that can lead to different outcomes in terms of convictions, what a person is convicted for, and sentencing. And I just suggest to you that there's research showing that someone who is sitting in jail as they await trial is more likely to take a plea agreement and plead guilty than someone who is back at home, right? And often this is more the case with lower level crimes, misdemeanors, but there are people who will, if you're giving me the option of pleading guilty in exchange for time that I've already served in jail versus, fighting this case to trial, a person may make that decision that my economic interest, at least short term, which is how our brains are wired to think, is going to be best served by pleading guilty and getting out of jail and getting on with my life. And the final thing I'll mention is jury makeup. And this kind of goes back to representation of the actors in the system. But I brought this out separately, again, just to note that this is a space where there have been some steps forward in Iowa recently. The U.S. Supreme Court prohibits a prosecutor or a defense attorney from striking someone. In a criminal trial, you have the right to strike a potential juror for no reason, right? You don't have to explain why. But you cannot strike them for racially motivated reasons. That's what the U.S. Supreme Court says. But it doesn't say a lot beyond sort of jury pool composition and generalities in terms of what does a jury pool need to look like and how representative does it have to be. And the Iowa Supreme Court has really looked at this, I think, in a sincere and kind of deep way over the last 2 years roughly, a case out of Black Hawk County. And the first case was focused more on the makeup of the actual jury that was impaneled. The second case is looking The further cases have looked more at the jury pool. But if we use what we have typically used, sort of a rule that the jury has to be within, X percentage points of the population of the county as a whole, well, if that's 5%, that means in most counties in Iowa you can have 0, and you're within 5%, right? And so the court has tried to articulate, and I'm still kind of catching up on these cases, but tried to articulate what needs to happen and how we ensure that there is not systematic exclusion of potential jurors. In other words, how we can have the most inclusive and the most representative jury pools possible. So again, just some of my thoughts on where we might be looking to try to explain these disparities and some of the things potentially that we might be able to do to overcome these. I will say that there are dialogues, there are discussions going on. October 15th, about 2 weeks ago, the NAACP of Iowa, Nebraska hosted the Iowa Summit on Justice and Disparities. This is something they've done for, I think, 6 years now in Ankeny. And it is a very good, robust, and ongoing conversation about what Iowa's criminal justice system looks like, where there is space for reform, and what we can do to improve the numbers in Iowa. And it was at that event last month that Governor Reynolds announced the creation of a working group aimed at eliminating bias in the criminal justice system. We will see where that goes. We will see what the makeup of that working group looks like. We will see how sincerely it takes on whatever mandate it is given. But I think at least that is a starting point. I hope that that is a starting point. I also think that it's important that we not let sort of, symbolic steps obscure other hard work that we need to do. So I'm going to leave things there and open it up for your questions if you have any.
So I have a microphone and I will bring it to you. Just catch my attention. I'm going to start here and then I'm going to go over there.
This goes to the representation component.
Yeah.
In the 56 years since Gideon versus Wainwright, the states have performed at various levels in the responsibility toward giving the indigent proper representation. Louisiana, unsurprisingly, has been to the bottom all the way. How is Iowa performing?
Excuse me. So I don't have data to evaluate Iowa. This is actually something that I looked at with a student a couple of years ago, trying to look at how indigent defense systems are funded. And it's very complicated because, of course, we have 50 plus jurisdictions in the United States of America. Each of them does things differently. Indigent defense in state court is the responsibility of the state, and they implement that, some cases in broad, well-functioning public defender systems. In some cases, it is left to individual counties or cities to provide representation. Most of the places where these crises are emerging, Louisiana is one, Missouri is another that was in the news a lot about a year ago, are systems where there is not a strong statewide system, and I think in all cases where there is a lack of funding. And I would say that overall, the biggest problem with indigent defense funding in this country is that it is not a popular place for legislatures to spend money, right? Kind of going back to law and order mentality. We don't think about this in constitutional terms of protecting constitutional rights. We tend to think about it as money for people who committed crimes. And so I think that that's part of it. But again, this goes to the public, right? Public perceptions of who is in the justice system. Guilty people, people who committed crimes, not innocent people awaiting trial, presumption of innocence, the types of things that we might want to reorient our thinking to perhaps correct some of these problems. So where does Iowa fall in that? Iowa has a statewide public defender system. It has a mix of paid professional full-time offices, which are mostly located in Iowa cities. They all cover some geographic area. There's a complicated chart showing what counties the Cedar Cedar Rapids Public Defender's Office covers and for what crimes. They might go to Benton County for one category of crime, they might go to Tama County for other categories of crimes, and then that is supplemented with contract attorneys, with private attorneys who take these cases as at a court-appointed level. Iowa prided itself, before it had the public defender system, of having a really good system of private contract attorneys. The public defender system, I think, has regularized representation a bit more. It's still not probably to the level of systematized in the way that exists in other states. I don't think that there's quite the same level of system-wide training, the thought of, impact litigation, the way that some other states have conceptualized their systems. I would say that Iowa is, functional and doing a pretty good job in the context of an overall indigent defense system in this country that is vastly underfunded. I will say that most of the people doing that work, I think, are very committed. They are professionals. I still occasionally get calls or emails from people who've been charged with crimes, kind of asking what they should do, who should they get for a lawyer. Yes, you are probably going to get more individualized attention and have more resources if you can pay a lawyer. But are you going to get represented by somebody who is competent and well-trained if you have a court-appointed attorney? Yeah, you're going to have somebody who does this full-time and takes their job very seriously, but they're going to have a big caseload. They probably aren't going to be able to respond as quickly or consistently as either of you might like. So, it's one of those where, do we have a system that I think is falling below the constitutional minimum in Iowa? No. I think that we have a functioning system filled with really good people and funded at a level that allows it to operate. Could it be a stronger system? Absolutely. And that probably starts with money. I'll back up, though, and say, I always keep in mind that, we think about implicit bias, and we tend to think about law enforcement, prosecutors, judges. That's something to consider with defense attorneys as well. If I'm a defense attorney, I'm used to a lot of high volume, I've seen this before. Maybe I'm a bit cynical about how the system operates, how people get caught up in it, but I'm often viewing my work as triage, right? Trying to have the best outcome for a person. But that might not put me in a situation where I am as able to listen to unique circumstances or believe something that I've heard 15 times before, and this is the one time that it's true. So just, I think that that's another thing, that all of us need to be aware of this potential for, kind of these unconscious internal decision-making factors.
My question is very much related to the first one, and you've probably answered most of my question. But from reading about national problems, it does sound as though we have less problems with this than some other states. I would wonder if there might be something about economic situation also, that if you can hire the best defense lawyer in Iowa, are you going to come out better than as if you get a publicly appointed defender? And do we have enough public defenders so that they can spend time with each individual rather than seeing them for 10 minutes before the trial and say, well, I think, if you just plead guilty, you can go back home to your kids?
Should we better fund our indigent defense system? Do we need more public defenders? I think ideally, yes. Systemically, I'm kind of mixed about do we have fewer problems than elsewhere in Iowa? I don't think our indigent defense system is completely broken or in a crisis the way that Louisiana and Missouri are. On the other hand, should we be doing better? I think ideally, yes, we would. And again, going back to those numbers, we are in a very bad place in terms of these incarceration disparities, right? And that is something that I think we really need to try to figure out what can we do? What are the interventions that we need to implement in order to change those numbers, and look at it really, really carefully and critically. As far as outcomes, if you have $1 million in your bank and you get arrested for a crime, there might be attorneys who I would point you to first, and you might get a more robust, more resource-intensive defense. Having said that, if you were charged with a crime and you could not afford a lawyer, would I tell you that you can trust your public defender? Yes, I would. I think, again, we want to have more resources, better resources kind of across the board for indigent defense, but I do think we have really committed and professional people doing that work.
Thank you. I'm also concerned, in addition to poverty and race, I'm also concerned about mental health factors in prisons. I was, more than a decade ago, I was the ranking member of the Justice Systems Appropriations in the Iowa legislature. And because I mouthed off a lot about mental health issues, Dick Myers, who was my political leader, my caucus leader, sentenced me to be the ranking member of Justice Systems. So I visit, I know. I visited every state prison, and one of the things that was obvious was it did not look like Iowa because there were too many, way more black faces than I knew was accurate. But also, as I would go in to the prisons, I would always tell the warden that I was visiting with a bias, and that bias is that you, warden, are running a mental health institute. And they would always go, duh, I'm glad somebody recognizes that. And I can remember particularly the women's prison, the warden there told me at that time, this is more than 10 years ago, at that time 65% of the women prisoners came in with a prescription of psychotropic drugs, which means they had a pretty heavy-duty mental health diagnosis coming in. I'm just wondering if the disparity, there's a disparity there, and the disparity can be kind of traced, I think, can be traced to, we reduced mental health institute beds in this state and really did it drastically in the last 10 years. And then you can watch the rise of not only the inmate population, but we had a big mental health institute program and a lot of beds, and we had no community corrections. And now we got, what, 30,000 people in the community corrections system in Iowa, besides the 8,500 inmates. So I'm curious how that plays in with poverty and racial disparities. And I think there's probably a connection.
Yeah. The piece of it that I don't know is how that relates to racial disparities in a unique way, and I'm really curious whether it does. My sense is that there probably is a very strong socioeconomic factor to the mental health issue that correlates with some of the racial disparity. That would be my guess. But I think, yeah, you talk with, I want to say any sheriff, but the sheriffs who I know, who I would talk with, as well as administrators in the prison system, and I think they would report that very thing, that they are dealing with a lot of sort of first response mental health issues. And this goes to bigger societal issues, right? That we're willing to pay for things on the back end that we're not willing to address up front, not willing to provide the treatment, the interventions, and probably ties to education, right? And healthcare. What's happening in formative years for a lot of people who end up in the criminal justice system because of mental health issues. And that's what it blows up into, and that's the first place where we have any chance at treating it. So I'm kind of intrigued by the question of, is there a connection with the racial disparity? I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, going back to the factors that I listed, that, those were the ones that kind of came to me thinking this through. And there could be something there, certainly in terms of our criminal justice system, broadly speaking, all of these complicated factors that lead to inefficiencies and, I would say, less than optimal outcomes. Mental health is a big piece right in the middle. So that's not a terribly satisfying answer, but I appreciate you raising it, and I think, in any conversation about the criminal justice system, mental health needs to come up and be recognized as, kind of a core issue that leads to these perhaps unnecessary criminal encounters down the road.
Brian, we're back here.
Yeah.
This also speaks to the corrections system. We now have a woman, either is she the warden at Fort Madison or is she director of the Department of Corrections?
We have a woman who is a director.
Okay. And I know almost nothing about her except that this is a white female, but does having a person who is even just that little bit out of the mold perhaps bring some insight into implicit bias and some of the other entrenched practices in the Department of Corrections?
Perhaps. I don't know much about her. I can't think of her name. Does anyone know it off the top of?
I don't remember her name, but she's also a social worker, therapist.
Yeah. Skinner, yes. But she was at the conference last month, and she was part of a panel, and she's relatively new in that position, and she was there in jeans and canvas high tops, which just struck me visually as, okay, so you're not the typical director of a state agency. So I don't know enough about her to comment on her personally. I think that going back to that, who's making decisions in the system, and again, sometimes these are intentional, maybe we would see them as malicious decision-making processes, but sometimes it's just, here's my perspective. And that perspective is the perspective that is very much dominant and very much entrenched and repeated. So I certainly think that there is some potential for a different approach. I also think that, when you deal with these big systemic, how do you change, sometimes it's structures, a lot of times it's culture as well. And I don't know. I think it is, on the face of it, I would think of it as hopefully a positive thing. I also think often it is, multiple layers of that over time. The change isn't immediate, but when we have, a female director and 3 female wardens and, 5 women on the Iowa Supreme Court and 30 women as prosecuting attorneys in 99 counties across, okay, at that point, maybe we start to see more of that shift in how that impacts decision-making, how that impacts structures, how that impacts incentives, how that impacts attitudes. Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps implicit bias training with the legislature would result in different outcomes.
Yes, I will say that, implicit bias training, this is something that comes up even in hiring, right? And we talk about it in universities. It's hard to get people on a hiring committee trained on, here are things that we need to be aware of that may impact our decision making. How do we focus more on established objective criteria? That can be difficult even in environments and institutions that you might view as, more open to that or perhaps more progressive. So, I think that just the more that there's this understanding, and again, this may take a lot of time, that's not a reason to be complacent, but the more that we can kind of understand that this is science, this happens, it's normal for humans, but we also want to make sure that it's not impacting how we are making our decisions or leading to unfair outcomes. I think how do we insert that in more places in our decision making, in our institutions? That's going to be a lot of work for a long time, but I wholly suggest that you be there that first week of January and let them know that before they gavel in, it might be useful.
Okay. I would like to share a case history that kind of illustrates two factors that I think indicate where some of this comes from with the racial disparity. And that is the extreme ease of how a young black male gets into the system and how extremely difficult it is to extricate yourself from that system once you're in it. I'm going to take about 60 seconds here, and it's going to describe a situation where both of those are illustrated. I spent my life, I'm 70, living as the minority. I graduated from high school at age 16. Economic reasons, I lived in the inner city of Des Moines, 10th and University, if any of you know where that is. My 20s, I was in the black neighborhood of San Francisco. My 30s, I was in the black neighborhood, the Capitol Hill district of Denver. My 40s, I was in Harlem. I presently live in Oak Hill Jackson, which is kind of a high minority, but very functional neighborhood, very highly functional neighborhood. Well, this anecdote, this case history starts a few blocks from where you live your life at the university. A young black man at age 18, he had changed, addresses had changed, and a notice to appear in court because his dog had been loose. He did not get the warrant. He was arrested for a non-appearance when I went to, this is a man that our family adopted at age 4 after his mother passed away. When I went to the jail to extract him from the jail, the look on his face was incredible, like a trapped animal, literally. He was the captain of the City High Championship statewide running team, both track and cross country. He got a scholarship for both academics and his athletics at Cornell College. And then in his 20s, he was arrested again in Iowa City, and they already had a record. He'd already been in jail. So he had adopted early, being a very intelligent young man. He dressed impeccably. I mean, he looked like he was out of GQ because he knew that profiling was a serious reality. Mm-hmm. He was arrested for a misdemeanor that any of the white sorority guys a few blocks away would not have been arrested for. And if they were, our family did assemble about $10,000 for a good attorney. The good attorney got stuck in a car and didn't make it to court, so he was quickly assigned and again, I think the public defenders are hardworking, but they're just shuffling so many papers, so many cases, and in a very quick lobby decision, they entered a guilty plea on a misdemeanor, and however, with the promise that he would not go to jail. The entire sentence would have been 1 year on this misdemeanor. Well, this is now how he got into the system. When I picked him up at jail about the dog, I said, would you have arrested a middle-aged white suburban woman? They said, well, we don't know about that. Well, I know about that. So now to be extricated out of the system once you're in it, the parole system was designed as a gotcha program. He was given a list of behavior requirements that no one in this room. He was arrested in a restaurant because they sold alcohol, and it was one of his items of terms of his parole that he cannot be anywhere where alcohol was sold. He was sent to Mount Pleasant for a parole violation, even though the original crime was a misdemeanor. Mm-hmm. He had already been this life of an extreme promise, academics, athletics. He's now in the system, and he already was beginning to experience depression. They loaded him up with 8 psychiatric drugs. Now we have the intersection of 2 extremely broken systems in the state. The criminal justice system and the mental health system, both absolutely inoperable. And if you think I'm extreme, then I know the truth.
Yeah.
I've seen the truth.
So-
Now let me just finish.
No, go ahead.
I have 2 seconds and I'll tell you the end. It was all too brief. This young man died at age 40 with extreme toxicity of the 8 psychiatric drugs and an underlying epileptic seizure. Now there's your story, fellow.
Yeah. So I want to go back.
It's easy to get in. It's almost impossible to get out. He found his way out. He found his freedom, and may he rest in peace.
Yeah. So one thing that struck me as you were talking about that, you know, in the system, lawyers, judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers, police officers are always thinking about individual cases, and they're always thinking about differentiation, like what's happening in this unique case. And my guess is if you went and talked with the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the police officers, the corrections officer, the probation officer who revoked probation, I bet each of them would sincerely, I suspect, or could sincerely tell you this wasn't about race, this wasn't whatever, this was because of these unique circumstances related to him, his story, his situation, here's why we had to do it with him. And yet, we add up all of those individual stories, and this is what we get, right? And this is where I think, you know, we have this challenge in the legal system, that everything is individualized, specific, case-focused, and in that world, when we're looking at only one case, we can always I don't want to say always, but we can often justify, well, here's why this happened, here's why I pulled over this driver. But then we add up the numbers and say, but we keep doing it, and it keeps looking like this in the end. And that's what I think is why that type of thing is why we need to look and say, why is it that this, in the aggregate, adds up to these very disproportionate numbers? Why is it that we keep doing it with this population? Yeah.
During my 20s, I was hired by the state of Iowa. I'm 70, I worked with every single man who got released from Iowa's prisons. Back then, it was animals from Fort Madison, that days. Everyone getting out. And I can tell you the story of how easy it was for Black Americans to be swallowed into the system was repeated again and again and again. And I lived at Temple University.
Yeah.
These are my neighbors.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Won't you help me to thank
My African-American male high school grandson. And I work with high school students of color. I'm very sympathetic to the story that he told, because what we teach our young people is that education is the way to stay out of the system, and that if they slide off the track, they will never recover. Now, all of these statistics and numbers are compelling, but as a person who works on the ground with kids, I can tell you that they need to be educated, they need to be kept out of the system, because once they get in, that's it. On 2 days ago, I was working with 50 young Black boys who, if any of you saw them on the street, would say, I'm going across the way. They are no good. They are not going to amount to anything, because that's what they forget. They're just sitting in your family. When somebody has to deal with them, somebody has to work with them. Over-representation, yes. Implicit bias is really just semantic differential or stereotyping and racism. All of the business of jury selected is true, but in Iowa, what do you do? We've got And so I just felt compelled to say that, but I'm always one who has to read something before it's over and go and do something else, which is what I'm going to do now.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your life story that you shared and the work that you do. It's a hard issue. It's just a hard issue, and we have to address it every single day. So thank you for your work, Dr. Farrell, and thank you for the information.
Yeah.
Be back next time. Intersections is always the first Friday. Would love to have you here. Make your reservation. We have a professor, Melissa Tully, from the University of Iowa, who's going to talk about attacks on the media and journalism in our nation. Not that that's ever happening recently, but she will be presenting about that. So have a great weekend.